The Art of Influence, Your Competitive Edge by Jim Stovall and Dr. Ray Hall. I'm your narrator, Rich Germain. Chapter 1. Understanding Influence. Influence is everywhere, all the time, whether we realize it or not, by Jim Stovall. Among the billions of people who inhabit the earth today, there are very few aspects of life that touch us all, but without exception, we are all influenced by outside forces, just as we influence the world around us. It is impossible to avoid influencing others or being influenced by them. Even those whom we treat indifferently are influenced by our indifference, just as we are influenced by those who may totally ignore us. Therefore, it is incumbent upon us to understand influence and become proactive in how we influence others and allow others to influence us. This book is my fourth literary collaboration with Dr. Ray Hall. Previously, we have combined our efforts in the art of communication, the art of presentation, and the art of learning and self-development. My work with Dr. Hall is a product of influence. A colleague at the U.S. Department of Education, Joanne McCann, went out of her way to introduce me to Ray and challenge me to consider how we might combine our efforts. At first glance, it would seem that a blind guy like me and an eminent expert in the field of audiology like Dr. Hall would have very little, if anything, in common. But Joanne's influence on both of us birthed a creative output that would not have been possible by Dr. Hall or myself individually. This book was originally envisioned as a project that would focus on leadership, but due to the creative influence of Dave Wilderson at my publisher, Sound Wisdom, I came to understand how many books had already been written about leadership, and while important, leadership is dwarfed by the overarching concept of influence. All leaders are influencers, but not all influencers are leaders in the traditional sense. I remain grateful to Dave Wilderson for influencing me and my readers through this book. Influence impacts every area of our lives. If you think of people who are antisocial or involved with the counterculture, you might assume that they are not influenced by the world around them. But after further reflection, it becomes inescapable that even these people who have chosen to be outside the norm are impacted by the very norm they reject. To be the opposite of something, you must first identify it, then move in the other direction. One of the best sales trainers I know is fond of saying, "You cannot not decide." This reminds us that delaying, ignoring, or avoiding a decision is a decision. An elected representative charged with the responsibility of voting on behalf of his or her constituency who abstains during a critical vote has made an influential decision that will impact the outcome of the ruling. When I was growing up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, our family attended the First Baptist Church. I was greatly influenced by lessons I learned there, and the pastor, Dr. Warren Hultgren. Listening to Dr. Hultgren speak each Sunday influenced me to become a corporate convention and arena speaker myself. His style of communicating and presenting was infectious. He drew people toward his message instead of thrusting it on them. Dr. Hultgren and I became great friends, and he influenced me throughout his retirement years and up to the time of his death. In many ways, he still influences me today. While I don't attend that church very often today, due to my travel schedule surrounding speaking engagements as well as book and movie projects, whenever I'm home, I listen to the Sunday services that are broadcast on the radio. A gentleman I greatly respect named Diron Spoo is now the pastor, and I will never forget a point he made within one of his Sunday messages saying, "There is no neutral influence." That simple quote involves a depth of wisdom that it is difficult to fully grasp. If we realize and accept the fact that everything we do, everything we say, and everything we think will influence us and everyone around us, we are compelled to live our lives in a different way. Whether we're examining our personal or professional lives, our progress often seems random and chaotic. We seem to be buffeted about like an autumn leaf in the wind, with little or no control of ourselves or the things around us. But then, from time to time, we achieve a victorious milestone or suffer a devastating defeat. When we look back over our lives from these high or low vantage points, we discover that what seemed like random chaos was actually influential forces impacting us that culminated in our success or failure. If our success, failure, or very existence is dependent upon these outside influences, it is incumbent on us to take control of our destiny and choose how we will be influenced and how we will influence others. Often powerful influences begin as tiny seeds that years later can emerge as irresistible forces or immovable objects that shape who we are and what we do. Neonatal experts have discovered that we are influenced by motion, sounds, and other stimuli even when we're in the womb. And if you've ever been in the home of a family expecting a baby, you will certainly understand that the child has a great influence on people and things around it before it's even born. I was born my parents' third child, but my older brother and sister both died at a very young age. I never knew my brother as he passed away from a lung disorder before I was born, and my sister died of a form of leukemia when I was a small child. It's difficult for me to separate what I remember of my sister from the family stories and photos of her that were shared with me later. Although I was an only child, until my younger brother came along when I was in kindergarten, the influence of my older brother and sister was felt throughout my formative years and to this very day. I have written over 40 books, and thankfully they have all been well received. But by far my most successful title is a novel I wrote entitled The Ultimate Gift, which was made into a movie with 20th Century Fox. If you've seen that film and experienced the powerful performance Abigail Breslin gave as the character Emily, you will understand that I was influenced greatly by my sister as I wrote about a young girl named Emily dying from leukemia. Our influence precedes our birth and continues beyond our death. The popular term legacy is nothing more than the ongoing influence our lives have on the world even after we have passed away. We have a tendency to think of events in our lives as either good or bad. We win the lottery and believe that it is good, or we suffer a financial or career setback and consider it to be bad. In reality, we can choose how events influence us. For everyone devastated by a tragic occurrence in their life, I can show you someone else experiencing the same tragedy who uses it as a springboard toward their goals and their eventual success. Many events that would be considered positive can turn out to have a negative influence on us. Lottery winners file for bankruptcy within a few years of winning their prize at a rate higher than the general public. Getting a promotion or a better job might seem to be a positive influence on the surface, but not if it keeps us from starting our own business or moving toward the job of our dreams. As a young man, I had no greater ambition in life than to be an All-American football player, then move on to make my living in the NFL. The coaches, scouts, and experts that evaluate players assured me that I had the size, speed, and talent to reach my goal. So I felt the course of my life was set, and I didn't worry about anything else such as studying or preparing for an alternative career. Then one year, during a routine physical exam to go play another season of football, I was confronted with one of the greatest influences of my life. I remember going through that routine physical, which was simply the standard operating procedure before the football season began. The doctors poke you, prod you, measure you, and weigh you, and everything seemed to be going smoothly, as it had in previous years, until one of the doctors shined a light in my right eye, and then feverishly wrote something in my chart. He picked up a phone and called for another doctor, who rushed into the room and shined his light in both my eyes, then nodded to the first doctor and left. Eventually, a third doctor came into the room and ran several other tests that were quite involved and had not been part of my previous football physical examinations. Finally, the three doctors took me down a long hall and sat me down at a conference table where they told me they weren't sure why or when, but were certain that I was going to be totally blind and there was nothing they could do about it. My whole world seemed to stop in that one moment. My plans of being an All-American and NFL player were gone in the proverbial and literal blink of an eye. At this writing, that was more than 40 years ago, and living my life as a blind person influences me every day. But it might surprise you to know that the influence has been and continues to be overwhelmingly positive. We don't always have a choice about what happens to us, but we can always choose what we're going to do about it and how we're going to allow it to influence us. Realizing my football career was over, I enrolled in a local college, desperately trying to make sense of my looming blindness and grasping for a new direction regarding what I was going to do with the rest of my life. As I began attending classes that fall, it quickly became apparent to me that my previous academic apathy and lack of effort had left me woefully behind my classmates. On top of the scholastic challenges, the football doctors were proven right when my eyesight began to fade, and I found myself unable to read and struggling to get around on my own. I did what I thought was the only logical, sensible thing to do, and dropped out of college. Then, one of the greatest influences in my life began to pursue me with a passion. I had met Dr. Harold Paul in one of the few classes I had attended before dropping out of college. Dr. Paul taught humanities, and I didn't know at the time that he was considered one of the world's leading experts in his field and had received the highest honors both as a scholar and an educator. I took a job as a construction worker, which was the only thing I knew how to do at the time. I had no particular skills or talent, but I was bigger and stronger than most of the other guys on the job. So I shoveled concrete, unloaded steel, or did whatever other difficult, hot, and nasty jobs needed to be done on the construction site. Dr. Paul got in the habit of showing up wherever I was working around the lunch hour. It is ironic and comical today to look back on that eminent scholar and renowned educator wearing his immaculate suit while sitting on a pile of boards with me eating a sack lunch. Without overtly prodding or nagging me, Dr. Paul encouraged me to consider returning to college and resuming my education. Not only did Dr. Paul influence me, but his noontime appearances began to have an influence on the other construction workers on the job, to the point where they virtually forced me to quit my construction job and re-enroll in college. The next fall, I was back in the same classes, with less vision than I'd had the year before, and another year removed from my weak academic preparations. But I had one thing going for me, which was the influence of Dr. Harold Paul. The university I attended had never had a blind or visually impaired student before, so Dr. Paul knocked on doors, kicked others down, and created a system for me to receive my education. One of the provisions that Dr. Paul made was to arrange for other students to read my textbooks to me. The greatest influence in my life appeared in the form of one of those college students tasked with reading my textbooks aloud to me. The moment I met Crystal, I knew I wouldn't need any other readers because somehow I understood I had just met the most significant and influential person in my life. At this writing, we have been married 37 years, and Crystal continues to be the greatest factor in my success. With Dr. Paul clearing the way and with Crystal's support, I discovered that I was a good student, and I actually had a level of intelligence I had not imagined. 4 years later, I graduated second in our class, and it probably won't surprise you to learn that Crystal graduated first. I am absolutely convinced that without losing my sight, I would never have been an adequate student or even finished college, much less someone who graduated with honors. I came to understand that disappointments and even disabilities are powerless in the face of positive influences. Near the end of my college years, it became obvious to me that while a lot of corporate recruiters were on campus trying to hire many of my classmates, no one was very interested in a former football player who was rapidly going blind. Understanding that I probably would never get a job, the only logical course of action I could imagine was to start my own business. I told my father about my entrepreneurial aspirations, and he introduced me to the only self-made millionaire that he knew. Lee Braxton was born early in the 20th century and dropped out of school in the 6th grade during the depths of the Great Depression to start a business to support his family. Due to his amazing drive and talent, Mr. Braxton became a multimillionaire, gave away most of his money to charity, and lived the rest of his life managing his investments. I met Lee Braxton late in his life, and he became the next great influence in my world. I discovered Mr. Braxton to be an elderly, gruff, and somewhat abrupt individual at our first encounter. He thrust a book at me entitled Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, saying, "Read this, then come back and we'll talk." I had never heard of the book nor the author, but began reading and discovered Napoleon Hill, who had been dead for over a decade at that time, to be the next great influence on my career and success. Napoleon Hill was born in the 19th century and changed the world in the 20th century primarily through the books he wrote. As a young newspaper reporter, Hill was given the assignment to interview Andrew Carnegie, the founder of U.S. Steel and one of the richest men in the world at that time. Napoleon Hill asked Carnegie the secret of becoming rich, and Carnegie's answer influenced Napoleon Hill and the world for generations to come. Carnegie explained to young Napoleon Hill that no one had ever really quantified the secret to success and wealth, but if Hill would be willing to commit the next 20 years of his life to uncovering these secrets, Andrew Carnegie would open the doors. Napoleon Hill agreed to take up the challenge, and Andrew Carnegie introduced him to hundreds of the most successful and prominent people of the day, including Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Helen Keller, and many others. These hundreds of success interviews were synthesized by Napoleon Hill into his book Think and Grow Rich, which was released in 1937 and remains the best-selling book of its kind to this day. After reading Think and Grow Rich, I returned to meet with Mr. Braxton, and he made Napoleon Hill's words come to life as he taught me how to be an entrepreneur. Years later, when I had achieved my own success and become a multi-millionaire myself, I chronicled my journey from poverty to prosperity, including my time with Mr. Braxton and the influence of Napoleon Hill, in a book I entitled The Millionaire Map. Don Green, who runs the Napoleon Hill Foundation, read my book and called me with a question that astounds me to this day. Don asked, "Jim, did you know that your mentor, Mr. Braxton, and Napoleon Hill were best friends?" I was in shock, and Don went on to explain that Lee Braxton had given the eulogy at Napoleon Hill's funeral in 1970. Don Green gave me a file of letters written over a 20-year period between Napoleon Hill and Lee Braxton. I treasure these letters, and they will become the basis for a future book of mine, but until then, they provide me with ongoing reminders of the power of influence. In the coming chapters, with the able guidance of my co-author, Dr. Ray Hall, you will begin to understand the influences in your life and learn how you can make them your slaves instead of your masters.